Most people lose the psychological game of life before it even begins, and the worst part is, they never realize it. They walk through the world loud, predictable, emotionally available, reacting to every message, every opinion, every little shift in attention, like trained animals waiting for approval. They think presence means visibility. They think connection means constant availability. But power has never worked that way. Power lives in the shadows between actions, in the silence between words, in the tension of uncertainty. And if people forget about you the moment you leave the room, if their mind moves on to the next distraction without resistance, it means you are easy. Easy to understand, easy to predict, easy to replace. Weak men beg to be remembered. Strong men make forgetting impossible. There are cold laws that govern the human mind. Laws that existed long before social media, long before modern society, long before polite conversation and emotional validation became the currency of weak people trying to survive in a competitive world. These laws are older than empires, older than kings. They come from the deepest parts of human psychology, the part of the brain that still thinks like a hunter, a rival, a predator. And the brutal truth is this: people do not obsess over what they fully possess. They obsess over what escapes them. Your mistake has always been accessibility. You answer too quickly. You explain too much. You reveal your intentions before the game even begins. You behave like an open book in a world where mystery is the only currency that multiplies value. This is why people forget you. This is why your presence fades the moment you leave. And this is exactly why certain individuals seem to haunt the minds of everyone around them. Not because they try harder, not because they talk more, but because they understand a darker rule of the mind. The first trick is this: become psychologically incomplete. The human brain is obsessed with closure. It hates unfinished patterns. It hates unanswered questions. It hates uncertainty that cannot be resolved. When the brain encounters an incomplete experience, it begins looping the situation over and over again, searching for answers. This is why people replay awkward conversations in their heads at night. This is why a mysterious look, an unfinished sentence, or a sudden withdrawal from attention can echo in someone's thoughts for days. Weak men destroy this mechanism without realizing it. They rush to explain themselves. They clarify every misunderstanding. They chase closure like beggars chasing coins. If someone looks confused, they immediately try to fix it. If someone misunderstands them, they jump in to correct the record. They are addicted to resolution, but psychological power lives in the unresolved. Imagine a chess match where every move is predictable. There is no tension, no intrigue. The game dies before it becomes interesting. But introduce uncertainty, introduce calculated silence, introduce a move that cannot be easily understood, and suddenly the opponent becomes obsessed. They study the board, they replay possibilities, they think about the game long after it ends. That is exactly what you must become, a move that cannot be easily explained. When you speak, do not empty your mind onto the table. Say less than necessary. Leave a small space of interpretation. When you leave a conversation, do not drag it into a comfortable ending. Let the final moment linger unfinished. A subtle shift in tone, a calm smile that hides more than it reveals, a statement that sounds simple but carries layers the listener cannot immediately decode. The brain will do the rest. Because once someone senses there is more beneath the surface, curiosity begins hunting for answers. And curiosity is a predator that never sleeps. You must understand something dangerous here. This is not about acting mysterious like a cheap magician hiding tricks behind smoke. That is obvious. That is weak. True psychological incompleteness is calm, natural, almost accidental. You simply refuse to over-explain your existence. You allow silence to hold part of your presence. And the moment people realize they cannot fully read you, they start thinking about you long after the interaction ends. Trick number 2 is even darker. And this one separates the amateurs from the true psychological predators. You must control emotional rhythm. Human attention does not lock onto stability. It locks onto contrast. Think about the rhythm of war drums before a battle. Silence, then impact. Silence, then impact. The tension between those two states is what electrifies the mind. Constant noise becomes background. Constant kindness becomes invisible. Constant presence becomes ordinary. Weak men live in a permanent state of emotional availability. They are always supportive, always responsive, always predictable in their warmth. At first, this seems admirable. But psychologically, it becomes white noise. The brain adapts to it. It expects it. And once something becomes expected, it loses its power to command attention. But when emotional rhythm changes strategically, the mind cannot stabilize. This is why certain leaders, certain historical conquerors, and certain psychologically dominant personalities throughout history understood the power of controlled contrast. They were warm, then distant, engaged, then silent, attentive, then suddenly focused elsewhere, not randomly, never emotionally unstable, always controlled. The key difference is intention. Imagine speaking with someone who gives you complete attention in one moment. They listen deeply, respond thoughtfully, make you feel like the only person in the room. Then later, without drama, without hostility, they withdraw into their own world. Not cold, not rude, simply unavailable. Something subtle happens in the mind of the other person. They start wondering what changed. They start analyzing the interaction. They start wanting to earn that focused attention again. Weak men misunderstand this completely. They believe consistency means giving the same emotional output to everyone at all times. But psychological attraction, respect, and fascination are not built on monotony. They are built on tension. Tension between presence and absence. When you master emotional rhythm, you create a pattern the brain cannot comfortably categorize. And whenever the brain cannot categorize a pattern, it begins observing it more closely. Observation turns into attention. Attention turns into mental occupation. Mental occupation turns into obsession. This is how someone begins thinking about you at random moments, not because you demanded their attention, but because their mind is trying to decode your pattern. Now, the third trick is where most people fail completely, because it requires something that weak personalities cannot tolerate. You must become scarce. Scarcity is the oldest psychological law of value. Water in the middle of the ocean means nothing. Water in the desert becomes sacred. Attention that is always available feels cheap. Attention that must be earned becomes intoxicating. Look at how weak men operate in social dynamics. They flood people with messages, explanations, reactions, updates, opinions. They make themselves permanently visible, permanently accessible, permanently present. They think this increases their importance. It does the opposite. The human mind instinctively assigns value based on perceived rarity. When something appears limited, the brain marks it as important. When something appears abundant, the brain relaxes and stops paying attention. This is why predators in nature move with patience. A lion does not chase every movement in the grass. It waits. It observes. Its stillness creates tension across the entire environment. Scarcity is psychological gravity. When you are not constantly present, your presence becomes an event instead of background noise. When you speak rarely but with precision, your words carry weight instead of clutter. When you appear only when it matters, people remember the moment. Weak men fear scarcity because they fear being forgotten, so they overcompensate with constant noise. But paradoxically, that noise is exactly what makes them forgettable. The mind remembers impact, not repetition. When you combine scarcity with psychological incompleteness and controlled emotional rhythm, something powerful begins to happen. Your absence becomes louder than other people's presence, and that is the moment when someone checks their phone, wondering if you reached out. When they replay a conversation trying to understand your words, when your name appears in their thoughts during completely unrelated moments. Because the mind does not chase what is obvious, it chases what escapes it. The mind cannot tolerate a mystery that refuses to resolve itself. That is the quiet engine behind obsession. And once you understand this, you begin to see how power moves in silence through every social interaction around you. Most people think influence is loud. They think it requires speeches, arguments, constant visibility. But the real operators of psychological gravity rarely speak more than necessary. They let other minds orbit them. The fourth trick is strategic indifference. Not fake indifference. Not childish games where someone pretends not to care while secretly watching every move. That is transparent. That is weak. Strategic indifference is the calm discipline of refusing to emotionally chase outcomes. Most people expose their desperation instantly. The moment they want approval, they lean forward too far. The moment they fear losing someone's interest, their voice becomes softer, their messages become longer, their behavior becomes accommodating. They begin negotiating their own value without realizing it. Humans are predators of emotional imbalance. The moment someone senses that you need their reaction, their respect, their validation, the balance of power quietly shifts. When you enter a conversation without emotional hunger, your energy changes. Your posture changes. Your tone becomes calm, measured, unhurried. You are not waiting for approval. You are not adjusting yourself to fit someone else's expectations. You are simply present, and presence without need is rare. Imagine two people in an argument. One person desperately tries to win. They talk faster. They explain their reasoning again and again. They raise their voice. They defend themselves with urgency because they need the other person to accept their perspective. The second person listens quietly. They respond slowly. They do not rush to defend themselves. They do not chase agreement. Sometimes they simply look at the other person and say very little. This silence creates pressure. Because when someone refuses to emotionally react, the other person begins reacting more. They fill the silence. They talk themselves deeper into the situation. They become aware that their intensity is meeting something immovable. Strategic indifference makes people feel your psychological weight without you saying a word. And when someone walks away from that interaction, something strange happens in their mind. They replay the moment. They wonder why you were so calm. They wonder if they revealed too much. They begin analyzing themselves instead of analyzing you. That is the shift. The fifth trick is frame control. Every interaction between two people is an invisible battle over reality itself. Not the objective facts, but the emotional meaning behind those facts. Whoever controls the frame controls the perception of the situation. Weak men surrender their frame constantly. Someone criticizes them, and they rush to justify themselves. Someone challenges them, and they immediately explain their intentions. Someone mocks them, and they defend their reputation with urgency. Every time you rush to defend yourself, you are stepping into someone else's frame. You are accepting their definition of the situation. Powerful individuals refuse to do this. Imagine someone says to you in a conversation, "You're too quiet. Why don't you talk more?" Most people instantly apologize or explain themselves. They say something like, "I'm just tired today," or "I'm just listening." But someone who controls the frame does something different. They might simply look at the person and say calmly, "Interesting that silence bothers you." In that moment, the frame flips. The conversation is no longer about why you are quiet. Now it is about why the other person is uncomfortable with silence. The spotlight moves away from you and onto them. Frame control is not about aggression. It is about refusing to accept someone else's psychological narrative. Another example appears in social power dynamics. Imagine someone tries to diminish your importance with a subtle remark. They say something like, "You're lucky to even be in this position." Weak men react defensively. They begin listing their achievements. They argue. They try to prove themselves. But someone who controls the frame might simply respond with calm amusement. Luck is a convenient explanation when someone doesn't understand the process. No anger, no argument, just a quiet shift in reality. Now the other person must deal with the implication that their understanding is limited. People remember interactions like this because the normal psychological script was broken. Instead of reacting the way they expected, you redirected the entire emotional battlefield. And when someone cannot predict how you will respond, their mind starts studying you. The sixth trick is the withdrawal of attention. Attention is the most addictive resource in modern human behavior. People chase it like oxygen. They measure their worth through reactions, messages, likes, recognition. And because they crave it so deeply, they become careless with it. They give it away constantly. They react to every comment. They respond to every provocation. They entertain every meaningless conversation. But attention is power, and power loses value when distributed without discipline. Think about how people behave when they first receive your focused attention. When you listen carefully, when you engage with them, when you notice details about their words or behavior. That level of attention feels rare because most interactions are shallow. Now imagine that same attention suddenly disappears. Not through hostility, not through dramatic confrontation, just absence. Perhaps you stop responding to meaningless provocations. Perhaps you end a conversation earlier than expected. Perhaps you shift your focus elsewhere when someone begins behaving disrespectfully. The moment attention is withdrawn, the psychological vacuum appears. Humans feel the loss of attention far more intensely than its presence. Because attention signals value, when it disappears, the mind instinctively asks why. Did I say something wrong? Did I lose their respect? What changed? Now the person who once took your attention for granted begins seeking it again. They adjust their behavior. They become more aware of how they interact with you. Weak men cannot execute this because they are addicted to engagement. Even negative attention feels better to them than silence. So they argue, they respond, they explain, they defend themselves endlessly. But the most powerful message you can send is sometimes the absence of response. Silence is a mirror. It forces people to confront themselves. And when someone finds themselves thinking about why you stopped giving attention, you are already occupying their mind. And most people allow strangers, co-workers, acquaintances, and even family members to drain that reservoir without discipline. Think about how easily people are manipulated through emotional provocation. Someone insults them, and suddenly their entire day is consumed by anger. Someone criticizes them, and they spend hours defending themselves in conversations that lead nowhere. Someone behaves disrespectfully, and they become obsessed with proving their worth. Every one of those reactions is a transfer of power. When someone can trigger your emotions on command, they are controlling your state of mind. And the moment your emotional state is controlled by someone else, your power disappears. Protecting your energy means refusing to give emotional access to people who have not earned it. It means observing provocations without immediately reacting. It means recognizing when someone is trying to drag you into pointless conflict simply because they want attention. Weak men fall for this constantly. They believe every insult requires a response. Every challenge requires a defense. Every misunderstanding must be corrected, but the disciplined mind understands something darker. Not every battle deserves your presence. Sometimes the most powerful move is to observe the provocation, recognize its intention, and simply continue walking. No anger, no explanation, no emotional reaction. This does something deeply unsettling to the person who tried to provoke you. Because they expected friction, they expected your attention, they expected the psychological reward of controlling your emotional state. Instead, they received nothing. And nothing is unbearable for people who crave reactions. The moment someone realizes they cannot easily access your emotional energy, they begin treating you differently. They become cautious. They become curious. They begin measuring their words more carefully around you. Because a person who cannot be emotionally provoked is difficult to control. Now, the ninth trick takes this principle even deeper. It is the discipline of auditing your inner circle with the precision of a military general. Every empire in history rose or fell based on the people closest to the center of power, not the enemies outside the walls, but the allies inside them. Advisors, commanders, trusted voices. If those individuals were weak, disloyal, chaotic, or foolish, the entire structure eventually collapsed. Your life operates under the same law. Look closely at most people, and you will notice something disturbing. The individuals closest to them are often the ones draining the most energy. Friends who constantly complain, people who gossip about everyone they know. Individuals who encourage distraction, weakness, and emotional chaos. And yet these relationships continue for years simply because they feel familiar. Weak men tolerate this because they are afraid of isolation. They fear losing connection. They believe loyalty means accepting any behavior from anyone who has known them long enough. But true loyalty is not measured by history. It is measured by influence. Ask yourself a simple question. When you leave a conversation with someone, do you feel stronger or weaker, clearer, or more confused, focused or distracted? Every person around you is either sharpening your mind or dulling it. The disciplined individual begins observing their circle the way a strategist studies a battlefield, quietly, without drama, without announcements, who encourages growth, who thrives on negativity, who respects your boundaries, who constantly tries to pull you back into old patterns. This observation leads to difficult decisions. Some individuals slowly lose access to your time. Conversations become shorter. Interactions become less frequent. Emotional transparency becomes limited. Not because of hatred, not because of revenge, but because proximity is a privilege. Think about the psychology behind this shift. When someone realizes they no longer have the same access to you, they begin asking questions. They begin noticing your absence in situations where you once appeared. They begin feeling the subtle distance, and distance creates awareness. Some people will adapt. They will begin treating your time with more respect. They will elevate their behavior because they sense that your presence is no longer guaranteed. Others will disappear entirely. Both outcomes are victories, because your environment begins aligning with your discipline instead of fighting against it. The final trick is where everything converges. This is the 10th law of psychological presence. Become impossible to predict, impossible to control, and impossible to break. Most people live inside patterns that can be mapped within a few days. Their reactions are predictable. Their emotional triggers are obvious. Their routines rarely change. Once someone studies them long enough, they become easy to manipulate. Push this button and they become angry. Say this phrase and they become defensive. Ignore them and they chase. Criticize them and they collapse. Predictability is the cage most people live inside. But the individual who understands psychological power moves differently. Their emotional reactions cannot be easily triggered. Their decisions are guided by observation rather than impulse. Their presence carries a calm unpredictability that makes people hesitate before trying to manipulate them. Imagine interacting with someone whose emotional center never seems shaken. Insults bounce off them without visible impact. Praise does not inflate them. Pressure does not rush their decisions. One day they are deeply engaged in conversation. The next day they are silent observers. In moments of conflict they remain composed while others become frantic. People around them slowly realize something unsettling. The usual psychological tools do not work. Flattery does not control them. Criticism does not weaken them. Pressure does not rush them. Silence does not scare them. And because the normal methods of influence fail, the mind of the observer begins searching for new ways to understand this person. They study them. They think about them. They attempt to predict their behavior, but prediction never fully arrives. And that is when your presence begins living inside their thoughts long after the interaction ends. Because the human mind is fascinated by what it cannot control. Now understand something important. None of these principles are tricks in the shallow sense people imagine. They are not social games meant to manipulate everyone around you for entertainment. They are disciplines, mental structures, a complete reorganization of how you move through the world. You stop reacting and start observing. You stop explaining and start allowing silence to carry weight. You stop chasing attention and start controlling when it appears and when it disappears. You stop giving emotional access to anyone who demands it. You stop surrounding yourself with noise. And slowly something inside you changes. You begin walking through conversations with calm instead of urgency. You notice patterns other people miss. You see manipulation attempts before they fully form. Situations that once pulled you into emotional storms now feel distant, almost predictable. The person who began listening to these words was reactive, available, predictable. That person believed influence required constant presence. That person believed respect came from explaining themselves. That person believed attention had to be chased. But that version of you cannot survive in the psychological terrain you now understand. Because once you see the machinery behind human behavior, you cannot return to ignorance. Your silence begins speaking louder than explanations. Your absence begins creating more attention than constant presence. Your calm begins unsettling people who depend on emotional chaos, and slowly the world around you changes its posture. People measure their words more carefully. They observe you more closely. They think about you long after conversations end, not because you demanded their attention, but because your presence leaves questions their minds cannot easily answer. And in the quiet space where those questions echo, something powerful becomes clear. True power is not loud. It does not beg for recognition. It moves through the world like a shadow that cannot be grabbed, a mind that cannot be provoked, a presence that cannot be owned. And the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has mastered the discipline of silence, while everyone else is still fighting to be heard.